We're part of nature. We're evolutionary. We change. We're supposed to change. We're supposed to have things that hurt so that we can grow from them. And when you have leaders that have this awareness of becoming more people-centric, it totally changes the way that the parts interact with each other. Machine thinking is about control. People thinking is about liberation. Freeing people to create, freeing people to innovate, freeing people to be who they are. Human-based thinking or people-based thinking is what can we do together?
Today on Strategy Shorts, I'm joined by Justin Foster. Now, Justin is a brand strategist of over 20 years. He's an entrepreneur, CEO, and now founder of a company called Massive. But rather than me making a mess of what that is and who you are, Justin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, Dan. Good morning from Austin, Texas. Thank you for having me on. I have a very unique background that led to forming Massive with my partner in all the ways, Virginia. And so Massive is kind of a reflection of both of our journeys, where mine is from like a college dropout, rural kid, raised in a Christian fundamentalist cult, right-wing Republican, a lot of unintegrated trauma and latent anger. And in 2014, I had a spiritual awakening, is the only way to describe it. And that led me on a journey to finding out that I really have these gifts. And I say this with humility, these gifts of helping people translate what their soul wants to say into the world. And I've chosen to call that branding because that's really what it is. But Massive is doing all of the things I've done for the last 20 years, but for business leaders that have some level of elevated consciousness and want to use their business, their status, their resources to take on systemic change. And systemic change could be social justice or environmental. It could be something more like that. Or systemic change could just be transforming their industry or anything that is liberating people to be themselves, anything that is freeing people to create, anything that is freeing people to express. That to us, that's all kind of systemic change. It's really liberation from oppressive systems is who we're working with.
So when did that change in direction occur? Like, I don't think we need to kind of dive back into the testimony or go into too much detail about the past, but there must have been a point where you felt that you were ready to move in a different direction. And I'm interested in understanding how you knew and how you embraced that sort of momentum in a new direction for you.
Yeah, I started to have the feeling that I wanted to use these gifts of mine for something different, probably 5 or 6 years ago, even before I met Virginia. But there were two kind of catalytic moments that propelled me into making a change. Two events, I would say. One was in early 2020, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis by the Minneapolis Police Department. And as a what I call a SWAM, which is a straight white American male, that I'd always been, sensitive or aware of racism and things like that, but somewhat blind to systemic racism and systemic issues. And I have Black family members, and so it was personal for me as my family, but also as a human. And then then COVID, and there was this sort of unwinding of like, wait a minute, am I contributing? And using kind of Oprah Winfrey's, she says one of her rules of life is don't add more darkness to the world. Is like, am I helping people that maybe they're good people, but am I helping them advance humanity? And then as an American, the other catalyst to like putting a line in the sand was January 6th, the insurrection in January 6th year. And that like bothered me at a different visceral level. And it was really then at that point that I began to put together kind of on my own, and then with Virginia, this idea of a strategy firm that was specifically designed for conscious business leaders.
So I guess as your sense of consciousness and awareness of the dynamics of the human condition started to grow and started to expand, you had this moment where you thought, actually, I can start supporting other people to take a similar journey. So when you're considering who to work with, what are you looking for? Like, what do they need to be bringing to the table in advance to be recognized as somebody who's moving in a direction that you can help with? Because there are going to be some people, right, who just aren't in that frame of mind yet, and they won't be able to capitalize
Right.
on the wisdom and the expression that you're bringing. So what do people need to have to be, I guess, considered conscious? I mean, it seems strange to say that some people
Mhm.
aren't conscious, but I guess there's a particular mindset that you're looking out for.
Right. And I'll use David Hawkins' model. David Hawkins was a famous psychiatrist who developed what he calls the map of consciousness. And it's a spectrum, as most things are. A spectrum between at the very top is enlightenment, at the very bottom is shame. And you can kind of overlay this with Maslow's hierarchy of needs to some extent too. Um, and so at the middle of this spectrum of the map of consciousness is courage. It's in the middle. It's not at the top. It's in the middle. Right below it is like anger. Like there's some other like survival traits, and then it gets down into like the really dark stuff, the abyss of the human condition. And it works its way up to, like, for example, logic is above the courage line, not below. And so that's the first thing we look for, is someone that has courage. And the first act of courage that we're looking for is that they have done the inner work. It takes tremendous courage, especially if you have built your life into some level of success, somewhat air quotes there, and that the hologram that you've created to sort of operate in the world, that if you already have done the work to re-examine that, that level of courage is the same level of courage, or the same starting point for courage to go out and actually lead systemic change. So courage is number one. Number two is a sense of humility, that they have been, for lack of a better term, something inside of them, the universe, God, whatever you want to call that, is calling them to do this. And it's a direct sort of counter to the life they've built. And so we get a lot of like, I don't know why I've been called to do this. Why me? And we're like, that's a great sign, because if you roll into doing your purpose, your mission, and you're super like confident in it, it might be a passion, but it's probably not a mission, because that prompts you to ask for help. Humility helps you ask for help. And the third marker is some sort of ability to communicate effectively. They typically are writers, speakers, and they're not always creatives, but there's a sense of communication that moves people rather than communication that manipulates people. And it may even be somewhat of a rudimentary skill, but we can work with that in rolling out kind of this plan for their life. And I would also say, Dan, that most clients come to us, they often come from marginalized groups. They come from, people of color, LGBTQ people, people from, different backgrounds. They don't typically come from like suburban normal, if you will. And so there's a sense of feeling a bit like a misfit. And the difference here, Dan, is they have a different relationship with power. Because I don't know about you, but every woman, every person of color, every queer person I know has been abused by power in some form, power over in particular. And that relationship or sensitivity to power is a huge factor as well. Now, again, I'm a straight white American male, and I know I have many high conscious white male friends, but there is a kind of, we're kind of the outliers of the outliers.
It's really interesting hearing you reflect on some of the conditions within which you exist, Justin, because I've been thinking recently about myself and about the advantages that I have as a white middle class male straight guy here in the UK, that I don't experience the same sense of closed doors and institutional blockades that other people from marginalized groups do. And because I don't experience them, it's sometimes hard for me to imagine that they exist, or I just don't think about them. And I think that's one of the great challenges that we face across society, is that when you are not coming across those kind of blockades on a regular basis, you just don't think about it. And because you
Hmm.
don't think about it, it's not on your radar, then
Hmm.
you don't act in a way to help those who are facing those kind of blockades. So it's a really interesting thing that I think that we all need to challenge ourselves to pause and reflect and think, what is the hidden advantage that I'm not even aware of? And if we can start
Hmm.
to think with that kind of mindset, we might start being more proactive, just naturally in the day to day, being more activists in the everyday. When we start thinking, what's the unfair advantage that I've got that I'm not even aware of yet, right?
Hmm. Yeah. And I would have a slightly different take on that. I mean, I agree with you, but just a little different, maybe perspective is more a question of what am I going to do with the advantage that I have, as opposed to, you can't really give away advantage. Um, and one of the things that we can do is we can speak to it, because there's a common thing, at least in the US, and I was there. The concept of white privilege I used to find very offensive, because I'm not a racist, never been a racist. And also because I grew up rural and poor and I worked my ass off to get to a level. But I did, the only kind of systemic injustice that I dealt with is the bias that businesses have about people without college degrees. That's it. That's the only one. And so what I realize now is you can be, someone that is very accepting of others. You can be someone that grew up poor, and there are systemic injustices within poverty as well, of course. But those are still better advantages in many cases to people that had to grow up in overall systemic oppression, whether it be generational oppression or within the current realm of things. And so one of the things that I point out is that there are really three kinds of consciousness. There's spiritual consciousness, which is its own kind of episode, really, about what that is. There's mental consciousness. What mental consciousness, I would say spiritual consciousness is an awareness that you have a soul and other people have a soul. Let's just simplify it to that. Mental consciousness is the awareness that you are not your thoughts and feelings. So we would call that like mindfulness. This is the stuff like Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, talks about, or Andrew Huberman, another neuroscientist. And those are all great. Spiritual consciousness, mental consciousness are great for living like a better life and a more peaceful life and a more motivated life. But one of the highest ones, and this is a common teaching of almost all spiritual teachers, the spiritual masters, is systemic consciousness or social consciousness. And that is the awareness of the patterns of power in societies, whether that be inside of a family, inside of a business, inside of a community, or inside of an entire society. And it's sort of what the movie Matrix was about, the ability to see that there's a system that's based off of power structures that some people benefit from and most don't. And from there, you can talk about various solutions and how to address that. But without seeing systemic consciousness, it usually sort of reverts to either denial or despair. Maybe I'm in denial of the change, or despair, which is sort of this like martyr mentality that you see with a lot of progressive people. Um, and neither of those actually create systemic change.
That's really interesting. So we've got that spiritual consciousness, mental consciousness, and systemic consciousness. And I think your point before about, what will you do with the privilege that you have? Just
Hmm.
such an important question for most of us to ask, because many of us from many different backgrounds will have some sort of privilege in some way. And I guess the first challenge of this episode, which is great that we got here. I wasn't expecting us to get here, but I think is to consider, what are you going to do with your privilege, with the advantages that you've been given, that you've inherited? How are you going to leverage those for the benefit of others and for the benefit of this broader systemic change? Because
Mhm.
everything needs to grow and move on and evolve. Like, we need growth, certainly here in the UK. I know that you guys are crying out for it in the US. So how can you be part of that, not in a personal way, but in a systemic way? Like, what's the exciting way that you can respond to some of those challenges?
Yeah. So, there's everyone's going to have their different journey, different answer to this. But considering that our primary audience are entrepreneurs, business owners, CEOs, is your business should first be a reflection of your level of consciousness. That's the first thing. Because as a business leader, you have advantages that the government and nonprofits and other institutions do not have. You have autonomy. You can make your own decisions, unless you're a publicly traded company, maybe not then, but if you're the owner, your business can be a reflection of your level of consciousness. It should be, actually. Um, and then you look at how you behave in the world as a business. And that's really how you treat others. So you see some levels of this with like DEI programs or, a concentrated effort to have more women in executive positions. And that's great. It doesn't really create systemic change. What creates systemic change is um, purely for the reason that it's the right thing to do, doing things within your business that the rest of humanity benefits from. And one of the main areas, Dan, that you can do to contribute more light into the world is change the way that you market what you do, and to challenge the fact that most marketing methods, even the terminology of like target audience or market penetration, is very much about very masculine and very linear in its view of seeing people as instruments to get you what you want. And if with some level of elevated consciousness, you realize that you are essentially just building a community of people that have a similar belief system as you, and that one of the ways that they can support you is to buy your products or services. So Patagonia is a great example of this. There are many other brands that are doing this, but that Patagonia is one of my favorites. So changing the way that you do marketing is being uh, direct and honest with what you're selling. It is not using any sort of gaslighting, what's called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, telling people that without your product, they're going to, die or will never have sex again or whatever, whatever you're using to manipulate people, is to end all of that. And when you do that, you are now inviting people to this kind of ecosystem of good in the world. And if you can build an ecosystem of good, many people benefit from that. And I'll give you another example, Dan. Etsy. Etsy was founded by a bunch of guys, several guys that wanted to create more like economic opportunity in the world. And as a fellow capitalist, I believe deeply in capitalism in a form of conscious capitalism. And I'm very against sort of institutional socialism or some variants of that because it's dehumanizing in many ways. So what they did is they built Etsy, and now Etsy, this is an interesting statistic, is Etsy is a company who generates billions of dollars, but the collective earnings of all Etsy makers, if they were put together as an economy, would be, I think, the 9th largest economy in the world. Imagine that. Imagine taking the tools that you have and this calling that you have and building a business where it helps people have sovereignty over their economic level in almost any place on earth. That's systemic change.
So we've got this idea of systemic change, and we're seeing how that can unfold into commercial objectives and how business owners can harness that type of perspective. But who are the people that you really want to reach today? So people who are listening to this podcast or watching online, who are the people that you would really want to speak to, who you think you've got to grab this and run with it because you're the one who can make an impact? Who would those people be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think actually think about that a lot because we don't have like a classic, gathering of people that we go market to. It's very sort of hidden in some ways. And I would say there's two kinds of people that I would love to help. We would love to help. One is higher conscious people within stagnant or highly institutionalized industries where there's like a rigidity of power structures. So you could look at, finance, for example, and you see some with fintech and some sort of systemic change issues, but they're rising within that. And what's interesting is they have often what I call PMS, which is pale, male, and stale. They're just like they're boring, but that's not the only issue being boring. They are perpetuating a systemic problem. You could look at, like, in the United States, at least, like mortgage companies and the built-in racial bias that the banking industry has, which has been highly documented. Another area is the senior executive or maybe a CEO that wants to build something separate from their current business because they don't feel like their business is going to be a vehicle entirely for what they want to accomplish. It could be too big, or it could be they don't see how it can align. And we sometimes help them with that. But that's what the moonshot experience that we have is about. It's about building something that's yours, that is basically a monetized, sustainable way of living out your calling or mission in the world. And the cool thing about being a CEO, other than having, or a founder, other than having, resources, is that you have power, that you can open doors, you can challenge people, you can do a lot of things that other people can't do. And Virginia points this out, and she's a lifelong activist, grew up in Nicaragua in the war, has been a feminist activist, social justice advocate for her entire, life, really. And she points out that social change used to come from the bottom, used to come with the people, kind of a populist view. And obviously sometimes that still happens, but within the areas that need the most systemic change, it's happening from the top. The decisions that business leaders are making related to the environment, for example, or in the United States, the passage of the Respect for Marriage Act, which codified the federal right to marry who you want. That came from corporate pressure. That's why Republicans voted for it. It came from corporate pressure. And so what we say is social pressure and market pressure are pretty much the same thing. And so when we would love to talk to people that see that as an opportunity, not a threat. It's like, oh, okay, I have this calling. There's this need in the marketplace, which comes from social pressure. Let's build something where everybody wins. And that's the most fun part, because you get into, systemic change is a heavy topic, but we want to bring innovation into it. And you really think about like the whole field of social entrepreneurism. It's my absolute belief that any business with led by a conscious leader can be a social enterprise. It's only the blockage of their biases and their mindset that keep them from becoming a social enterprise.
When we spoke just a couple of weeks ago, and we're sort of coming into land now, and we're going to end on something practical as we always do. What's been really interesting about this conversation, it sort of breaks away from the normal Strategy Shorts format because of the nature of the conversation that we're having and the ramifications if somebody grabs hold of this way of thinking and begins to move with their mindset and feel this new momentum that's comes from this kind of conversation. We're just in a whole other territory for Strategy Shorts, really, but we will end with something practical. Now, we spoke a couple of weeks ago, though, about moving from machine first thinking to people first thinking and moving towards perpetual excellence. And I wanted to make sure that we had a moment to just dwell on those concepts for a moment. So could you just unpack those ideas for me in a little detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a model that has been followed really since the kind of Newtonian age of science and the industrial age, which is that society is a machine and it is predictable on the way that it behaves, as long as you pull the right levers and push the right buttons. And inherent within machine based thinking is sort of the seedbed or the the fertile soil for white supremacy, patriarchy, things like that. Because that was the system. Machine thinking was the system that perpetuated those sort of institutional things. And we have adopted, even though we are, in a much more just society than we used to be in the world, in the United States, UK, and more integrated, more diverse, we still see people too often as machines. We use language as if they're machines. We call it burnout as an example. Burnout is a term used for machines. It's a small example, but there are many that we could get into. Well, the real thing with humans, and it's always been this way, it's just power kind of blocked it, power structures, is we are an ecosystem. We're part of nature. We're evolutionary. We change. We're supposed to change. We're supposed to have things that hurt so that we can grow from them. And when you have leaders that have this awareness of becoming more people centric, it totally changes the way that the parts interact with each other. And I would put it in kind of a very simple bifurcation, Dan. Machine thinking is about control. People thinking is about liberation, freeing people to create, freeing people to innovate, freeing people to be who they are. This is why I do not like the word empower. Leaders empower. No, they don't. Leaders can only disempower. They can only take away something. Empowerment is already within us. The concept, even within the U.S. Constitution, of inalienable rights is an example of this, or natural law. And so machine thinking, it works great if you have power and resources. It almost always comes at the expense of people and societies that don't. That's what colonization was, as an example, and the exploitation of people and resources. Human-based thinking or people-based thinking is, what can we do together? And it requires an entirely different set of leadership skills, what we call systemic leadership skills, starting with things like being a really good listener, as an example, being humble to ask for feedback from people that you're not necessarily credentialed experts. There's a lot of different ways we could get into that.
This has been a really fascinating and eye-opening discussion. And it's a shame that it's strategy shorts, because I feel that we could really deep dive a whole bunch of different subjects together. But as I said before, we're beginning to draw into the end of the episode here. And we want to land in something really practical for people to take away and try, which is challenging because this is such a broad topic and it is so expansive. But if you could offer somebody something to start with or something to apply as soon as the episode finishes, what would that be and why?
Well, I think it may feel like it is, you know, broad because everybody's different. Everybody's got a different story. But what we all have in common with each other, below all the social labels and everything, is a sort of inherent uniqueness as a human. We are very unique creatures. Not just because we have a neocortex and other mammals don't, but because of our ability to see the past and the future, the ability to create and tell stories. All of these gifts are there for a reason. And so the starting point that when I'm asked this question, I always say is, what inside of you, what thinking, what influences is blocking you from your gifts? We use fear a lot for that. It's like, oh, I'm afraid. Well, there's a great question that often coaches use, which is, what would you do if you weren't afraid? Which is a bit trite because we all have fear. But it begins with understanding and accepting your own gifts. And you have to see what's blocking you from living those. And it's a self-examination. Maybe a coach or a therapist or somebody can hold up a mirror and help you see it, but it's really up to you. Because I promise everyone this, that once you see that, you'll never see the world the same again. If you get just a little glimpse of your inherent powerfulness, of your inherent goodness, of your inherent worthiness, the way you live will be fundamentally changed. And the rest of it is really about execution. Once you're there, once you're in that place. And so whatever that looks like for somebody, Dan, whether that's, meditation or prayer or therapy or ayahuasca, it doesn't really matter how people get there. Is get to that center of you and see who you really are, and then remove the obstacles that are preventing the world from experiencing you as you truly are.
Justin, lots and lots to think and ponder on. It's been a really inspiring conversation, and thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule for Strategy Shorts. And I hope we can speak again soon.
Absolutely, Dan. Thanks for all the great questions.